Parrot TV, the voice for humanity.
Hi, welcome to the New York Parrot Literary Corner. We are the best and only daily TV show offering poets and writers and creative minds across the globe. We have a platform for you if you are interested. Get in contact with us. Today we have Jeannine M. Pitas, who is a teacher, writer, and Spanish-English literary translator. Her work has recently appeared in the American Poetry Review, the Christian Century, Beltway Poetry Quarterly, and the Paris Review. Her first full-length collection of poetry, Things Seen and Unseen, was published by Mosaic Press in 2019, and her most recent translations are of Selva Castle's We Do Not Live in Vain, Belize Books 2020, and Marosa de Giorgio's Carnation and Tenebrae Candle, Cardboard House Press 2020. She lives in Iowa and teaches at the University of Dubuque. Hi, how are you doing today, Jeannine?
Thank you so much for having me. I'm really delighted to be here and surprised. I didn't think I'd be on here today, but here we are.
Excellent. Glad to have you at such short notice. Sometimes we pull people up when they contact us. We get them as soon as they're available. So I'm glad you're with us, and we're having an interesting discussion today. My first question is about your book, Things Seen and Unseen. So what are you exploring in this book, and how did the writing the book help you develop your personality and your emotional sensibilities?
My personality, and you ask emotional sensibilities?
Right. Sometimes writing can be very healing, and it's a process of letting go of certain things. And I wonder if it helped you realize any new facets of yourself or anything like that.
I think that is very applicable, especially because it was my first book.
Mm-hmm.
And some of the poems in it were written as far back as 2003, and others were written as recently as 2015. And one thing that really is interesting about the book, it was published in Canada by Mosaic Press. And I had been living in Canada for 7 years. I did a graduate degree at University of Toronto. And when I finished that, I moved back to my native country, the US. I got a job in Iowa, which was a culture shock because it was not a part of the US I'd ever even visited before, but here I am. Life brings a lot of surprises. And in some ways, the book really represented so many of the experiences from those 7 years in Canada, plus my youth prior to that. And it took a while to get published. There were some glitches with the publication, and it actually came out 3 years later than what I was expecting. So when the book came out, it was such a thrill. I was not expecting so many people to attend the launch of it. I think I had 50 people. I was thinking I'd be lucky to get 20 people to show up, but my entire PhD thesis committee came. Old friends came from different aspects of my life in Toronto. And this was after I had been away for a bunch of years. So it was very overwhelming, but really moving. I was just really touched by that. And I'd say, yeah, the book itself really draws on a lot of themes from youth. It has 4 sections. It starts with some poems about growing up, coming of age. Then it goes into poems of love. Then it goes into religion and spirituality. And finally, poems of justice and social concern is how I would sort of describe the movement. The title Things Seen and Unseen comes from the creed in the Catholic Church in which I was raised, where we say that we believe in all things seen and unseen. It's been retranslated. Now we say all things visible and invisible, but same idea. Mm-hmm. And I was really thinking about that, what is it that we focus on what we see, but what about everything we don't see in terms of maybe a more spiritual dimension to life, but also this is where the justice piece comes in. people that are unseen. You know, I think we live in a very, it's obvious we live in a very unequal society where some people get seen and heard a lot more than others. So that was another dimension to this book.
That's an interesting way of looking at taking these creed, you know, the Catholic creed, and they usually referring to like spiritual matters, and you of course added social justice component, which is also part of the Catholic. But it's not a big prominent focus, at least in American society. But I think that's fascinating how you add that dimension to that creed and then bring that out. And so my next question would be, you know, since you're pretty well traveled, how is when you go to other communities that you've been in, and besides where you're at now, and what do you see differently than in each of the poetry communities? Is different kinds of approaches to poetry, or different ways of relating, or anything interesting that you can note about the poetry communities you've been involved in?
So I would say I'll begin with where I am now. So in Dubuque, I would say it's hard to sustain a strong poetry community. One thing I've been doing pre-COVID for a bunch of years was doing an annual reading affiliated with the organization 100,000 Poets for Change, which I got involved with through my friend Patrick Connors in Toronto. He runs it there. So that's one thing, and that's just an annual reading, but I've really enjoyed that because we've managed to include published, well-known poets alongside people who are really newcomers to writing, and to sort of have them all have the chance to share their work. I teach at a college, and one of my colleagues in my department teaches creative writing. I actually teach literature in Spanish. He's an excellent poet. His name is Andrew Jones, and he has organized some things in the community as well. And we have a writers group, but I feel like it's sort of been stopping and starting. And then COVID just threw everything off. I must admit, I was thrown for a loop, and I was actually one of the organizers of our writing group in Dubuque, but I just haven't been so motivated to keep it going with the virus. But now that we're starting to come back together and it seems like gathering indoors might be safe again,
Right.
I'm going to talk to the co-organizer about trying to get that going again. The poetry scene in Toronto, I found to be super vibrant. I would say it's not one scene, but many scenes. And I tended to gravitate toward really the Latin American community there. Since I'm a Spanish speaker, I was studying and teaching Spanish there. So even though I'm not from that community myself, I found I was warmly embraced by the Spanish speaking, largely immigrant community in Toronto. And they had and still have an extremely vibrant poetry scene. There's another ongoing reading called Shabasher, which is Persian for poetry night, run by a poet called Banu Zan, and it really aims to represent as much as possible the diversity of Canada, because in Toronto specifically, Toronto, according to the UN, I think is one of, if not the most diverse cities in the world. And that was really, I read there and helped organize that for a while. And I don't know, I mean, my experience of Toronto's poetry scene has been nothing but positive. I know that not everybody shares my view. I hear talk of cliquishness and the sort of thing that happens with any social group.
Right.
But in other places where I've been involved with poetry, Uruguay is amazing. So I translate Spanish to English, mostly writers from Uruguay in South America. Very, very small country, 3 million people, half of them are in the capital city, and poetry just flourishes there. It's really quite amazing. I feel like, I don't know, I wonder if you were to take a survey of countries and poets per capita, I feel like Uruguay would be very, very high up there because it's just so part of the culture. You go to Montevideo, there's a reading happening somewhere every night. And when I first went there wanting to translate a certain poet from there, whom I might talk about later, we'll see,
Mhm.
you know, that there was such enthusiasm. So many people wanted to help me. And I've since gone back twice. It's very far away and very expensive to travel to. But when I've gone back, I find the same thing. There's such a vibrant community there. And I miss it. I was supposed to go there in summer of 2020, which would have been their winter. And of course, the pandemic hit. So that
Right.
didn't happen. But I hope to go there once this is all over, if ever it is.
I hope so too. It sounds fascinating. And what drew you to the Spanish language and the Spanish community?
Thank you so much for asking that. I really think it was a number of factors. One of it was one was pure chance. I was in an elementary school that happened to offer Spanish as a foreign language just a few times a week. Not very good quality instruction at that stage, but I was just interested immediately. Learning a language was just kind of, for me, it was an easy thing. You know, we all have our strengths and weaknesses, and foreign language was just the class that I just naturally got the highest grades in. I just gravitated to, you know, ask me
Mhm.
to play sports, not, I'm kind of hopeless in that area, you know, working with my hands, doing crafts, not so much, but learning and studying a language is something that I'm really passionate about and just gravitated to. So you could say it was a matter of chance, but I also think I got interested in the culture largely because of having been raised Catholic. And, you know, Latin America is very diverse. It's many countries, many cultures, many religions. But just because of the history of Spanish colonization, the whole culture, I would say, throughout the Spanish speaking world is touched by Catholicism, even if, you know, even if in many countries people are no longer really practicing or they have embraced other religions. So, you know, I don't want to generalize and say, you know, and say that the Spanish speaking world is Catholic. It's not, but there's that influence there. And I
Right.
think the fact that I was in a Catholic school learning the Spanish language and learning about liberation theology in my religion classes at the same time became mutually reinforcing. And so that's where it started. I kept going through high school. And then in college, I was fortunate to really to be taught by poets.
Mhm.
Both of my main professors, two of my three main professors in college were poets themselves. They gave us the option to translate texts. They encouraged that as part of their teaching, which I try to incorporate some of that in my own teaching of Spanish now.
Mhm.
And really learning about the history of Latin America and US involvement in the region, especially US support of very terrible governments during the Cold War, really just had a big impact. So that's where it all started for me.
And speaking of that, I read your article in America, the Jesuit Review, and I shared that on Facebook. And I was going to ask, how was your actual experience of meeting with these realities of U.S. imperialism and the countries themselves versus reading about them? What was you know, like when you actually came face to face with some of, like looking at some of the effects in person, how did you feel about it versus reading about it or hearing about it somewhere on while you were in the US?
I think it's difficult. It's it's a very strange position to be somebody from the US who's not of Latina or Hispanic origin, but who's taken such an interest in this culture. And sometimes I have to ask, like, am I just another imperialist in a long history
Right.
of imperialists? Um, you know, there can, I think sometimes, especially among some young idealistic people from the US, like who want to go abroad and volunteer or that kind of thing, there can be a white savior complex that I had when I was young, not with Uruguay so much, but I also lived and worked in Nicaragua, and I was in a private Catholic school, and I had a very inflated and idealized vision of myself and the work that I was doing. And it just kind of hit against a harsh reality of me being a very inexperienced teacher in a very, very interesting school. It was like a very wealthy, privileged school in a very impoverished country. And I don't know, I mean, I think that was something like seeing the effects of these, like Uruguay and Nicaragua, they're like totally different as countries. Uruguay is very secular. Like the US, they have a genocide against indigenous people in their history and a lot of resettlement with European immigrants in the 19th century. They have a small Afro-Uruguayan minority who are descended from slaves. So it makes for an interesting dynamic. They're largely a middle-class society. And I did sometimes, it would be subtle, but like I think coming there as someone from the US, I did encounter some hostility. But when I explained that I wanted to translate this poet, Marosa di Giorgio, I was really embraced warmly and openly. And I've made friends who are still my friends to this day. So it's complicated because I think I certainly felt a certain amount of US imperialist guilt, but I was also there to try to learn and to just see what the country had to teach me and to develop as a translator. And so many people there helped me with that. My first translation mentors post college were Uruguayan. So that was something from there. And from Nicaragua, I think it was more of, there were a lot of hard lessons for me to learn there, many of which I didn't learn until after the fact. But it's a country with a lot of history of US intervention. The Contra War is probably the most recent and notorious example. It's very complicated there now because their president is the leader of the Sandinista revolution, but he has basically, and the Sandinistas now, like they have really turned away from their mission. They've become very, very corporate. There was a lot of controversy about how they were handling COVID at the beginning. In many ways, I would say Daniel Ortega was like a left-wing version of Trump with COVID denialism. But, you know, there were like, it was, I'd say there's a lot in Nicaragua that I was not really aware of my position there and what I was doing until after the fact. And I regret that. There's a lot that I would want to say to my younger self and to any young people who have the idea of like going to another country and volunteering in that. I would say, don't go to help, go to learn and go to experience.
So we can take a moment if you want to share a poem with us.
I'd love to. Where should I start with one of my own or should I start with one I've translated?
That's up to you.
All right, well, you know, maybe I'll start with translation because since I am just talking about Spanish and the Spanish speaking world, and Uruguay in particular. So the first poet I set out to translate is called Marosa di Giorgio. She lived from 1932 to 2004. I never met her. I started working on her work after she was deceased. And her poetry is known for having this child's perspective on a rural setting, and everything is just kind of infused with gods and angels and demons and monsters, and it's like this sort of fantasy world based in reality. So I'll read a little of that.
Okay.
¿Cómo andas por los lejanos aparadores? ¿Cómo vas libremente por los prados de mi infancia? Allí donde salían los soles de la medianoche, sombríos y dorados, 2 o 3 o solo uno, entre las negras copas, donde pululaban los ladrones. Y vas y tu paso brotan las culebras, arrollándose y estirándose, blancas como espuma, como el sol, doradas o de plata, como los muertos, hasta que empieza el jardín inmemorial de los gladiolos, ante el que siempre me arrodillé, llorando y sollozando, pero sigues omnipotente por encima de esas flores infinitas. Te apoderaste del todo, hasta de los recuerdos de cuando no te conocía. How you go walking through the distant cupboards, how you walk freely through the meadows of my childhood, there where the midnight suns came out, dismal or gold, 2 or 3, or else just one amid the black treetops where the thieves were swarming. And you walk, and in your trail the snakes appear, contracting and stretching, white as foam, as the sun, gold or else silver, like the dead, until you reach the immemorial garden of gladioli, the garden where I always knelt down, weeping and sobbing. But you remain omnipotent, ruling over those infinite flowers. You took control of everything, even my memories of the time when I didn't know you.
That's very powerful. Thanks for sharing that. If you'd like to share one of yours now, you can feel free to do that.
Sure. Maybe keeping with the same mood. Rather than reading one from the book, I'll read a new one. So this is called Buen Camino. A few years ago, I had the privilege of walking the Camino de Santiago, an ancient and then a medieval pilgrimage route across Spain. And it comes from that, and it comes from a trip I took just recently. But pilgrims on this route, when they see each other, either greeting or parting, they say Buen Camino, which just means have a good walk. So that's the title. And it's after Elena Ferrante, her book, Those Who Leave and Those Who Stay. As I walk, you walk with me, 20, 50, more than I can count. You form a procession of angels climbing the mountain, your footsteps so loud they drown out the song of the white-breasted desert lark, your all too human sweat competing with sagebrush fragrance. I called you here, you who no longer send me Christmas cards or birthday greetings, whose phone numbers I forget, whose addresses I've erased. First grade drawing companion Nicole Maciejewski, fellow pilgrim around the Cheektowaga, New York cul-de-sac, selling thin mints and peanut butter patties, each Girl Scout cookie season. Here you are now, offering me a hand to hold for the slippery ascent. Pablo of midnight walks along the Rio de la Plata one silver hot December night, our shoes filled with sand from the beach of a city that loves the sea. Here you are now, showing me which rocks are safe. Rhonda of a dank August stroll along the Mississippi River, marching toward Gatsby's green light. Here you are now, warning that the path narrows ahead. Ben of a confused romp down Frenchman Street, both of us strangers to the city of jazz and colored beads, the drunk leading the drunk past the tap dancer with a baby in his arms. Here you are now, tapping my shoulder and pointing up to the soaring hawk I might have missed while counting steps. You, my brothers, my sisters, my loves, it is not your death I grieve, but my own, since I am the ghost who wants to haunt you as you continue on paths chosen without me. Maybe not even a very orderly mind can endure the discovery of not being loved. And yet still I love anyone, anywhere, as much as I want, which is why I've called you here. As I approach the labyrinth's center, as I ascend sharp rocks to smooth sands above, and you have come, shadows whose footsteps I follow, as I dream of a mesa where we might rest together to marvel at the same red and blue mountains. And if I open my eyes and find myself alone, I will still call out Buen Camino. I will keep shouting love to each one of you, even if you don't hear me.
Wow, there's so much humanness to that, especially lines like when you're talking about the realization of not being loved yet loving anyway, giving it all the love you can out into the world. That's wow. Thank you for sharing that. That's beautiful. So do you find like, there's a difference between writing and teaching poetry?
Difference between writing and teaching poetry. Well, I don't teach poetry as a writer. I teach it from the literature side. So, so I teach it like from the criticism side, reading, but I see them as one and the same. Like when I'm teaching a general education literature class, I'm teaching students who are majoring in things like business, criminal justice. We have an aviation program at the University of Dubuque where I teach sports marketing and management. So like these are generally not what I would think of as poetry people, but they constantly surprise me by their curiosity. And I bring writing into it. So I didn't do it that way this year, but very often I'll have them study different poetic forms. Like we'll look at sonnets, we'll look at haiku, we'll look at free verse, and we'll look at different examples. And then I say, okay, try and write your own. And they do it. I give it to them as an optional assignment instead of they can substitute writing a paper with writing poetry and then talking about their process. Mm-hmm. And they try it and they get into it. And I don't know, I've never had anyone report back to tell me if it sticks with them or not, but at least for that moment, I believe anybody can write poetry. I don't see it as the domain of the privileged few. I think it's for anyone and everyone. And so I really like getting my students to try writing it. And for me, it reinforces me wanting to write it. I think, yeah, reading, teaching, writing, it all kind of links together.
That's very interesting. So when you're teaching comparative literature, do you ever find there's like a cultural exchange going on?
Can you be more specific? Like what kind of cultural exchange?
The different voices and poetry from across cultures, do they kind of interact in some way? Like, do you find commonalities between them, or do they speak to one another in some way?
It's you mean like just for me as as sort of a student of literature and like scholar of it, or you mean like for how my students react to it?
You personally.
Me personally. Okay, thanks. Yeah. Well, what's really funny about that, it's funny that you should ask, is I did my degree in comparative literature because I was into Latin American literature and I was also into Polish literature. So Polish is the first language I studied, and like that's the culture of my background and my heritage, even though my family's been in the US since the 1800s, but we still really identify with it strongly. In Buffalo, New York, where I'm originally from, there's like a strong sense of the culture, even many generations removed. So I got into Polish literature at quite a young age. I think especially reading people like Czesław Miłosz and Wisława Szymborska, who are both Nobel laureates who through translation became very popular in the US, ages ago in the 80s and the 90s. So like I somehow found out about them at a young age and got into Polish literature at a young age. And being into Latin American literature, again, at a young age, I was reading Gabriel Garcia Marquez, who is a prose writer, not a poet, but also I got into Pablo Neruda and his love poetry and also his political poetry quite young, and other Latin American writers. And I really saw a link, and I hate to say I risk being glib here, but like I think there's something I've noticed. I don't know. I had this anthology of world poetry as a teenager that I would draw on, and there seems to be something about particularly countries that have lived through hardship, World War II and then 50 years of communism in the case of Poland. So many dictatorial regimes in the case of most Latin American countries, that really produces a sense of urgency in the writing, that produces a sense of just having to speak truth to power against oppression.
Mhm.
And in the US context, I think it's really interesting the moment that we're living in now, because
Mhm.
the poetry that has dominated in the US has largely, honestly, I'll be quite frank, like I admire Walt Whitman and Emily Dickinson, but like until quite recently, a lot of the poetry being published in the US just didn't really move me very much. And I think
Mhm.
that's why I was drawn to study other cultures, because it's sort of like, yeah, the European American sort of male dominated
Right.
culture that sort of dominated the literary scene. And you know, like, I don't know, just sort of this, there was just this kind of homogeneity, and it just, I struggled like, I would occasionally find US poets that really moved me, like Stanley Kunitz
Yes.
is one that jumps to mind. I'm a sucker for
Mhm.
Mary Oliver. I know, like, you know, there are mixed views on her. I do
Mhm.
love her. But like, yeah, I don't know. I think that the moment that we're living through now, where at last there's a move to elevate underrepresented voices in the US that have gone unheard, will be very good for the poetry of this country, I think.
It'll be a rejuvenation for sure, and it puts more fire into the mix. With especially with all the conflicted political stuff going on that's been going on the last few years. I think definitely I agree with you. I like the way you phrased it, sense of urgency in the poetry, and I think there's some of this urgency coming out now. And as you said, there's that homogenization of white males, of in the Western world that have been taught and taught and taught and taught, and some of them are pretty dry and boring, honestly.
I mean, that's just, I mean, I've like there are a lot of, I think there are a lot of excellent white male poets in the US. I mean,
Absolutely.
Stanley Kunitz is
Mhm.
definitely one of them. I remember hearing him read when he was, I don't know, 99 years old, a poem
Wow.
about seeing Halley's Comet in like the early 1900s when he was a boy. And I can't remember the exact line, I'll misquote it, but something about like being afraid that the earth was going to get swallowed up, and his teacher saying, if that happens, there will be no school tomorrow. And he just has this very,
Hmm.
very, just this wonderful presence. And
Huh.
I mean, yeah, it's just a lot of the poets I admire most are white males. I guess they just happen to be
Right.
white males from the Spanish speaking world or from Poland. So yeah, that's
Yeah.
been where I've gravitated. Yeah.
Yeah. I find that I like when they're when you say sense of urgency, and I've read a lot of translations from Spanish and from other countries, and I do find that I really appreciate especially Spanish speaking poets myself, and a lot of there's something to it. I mean, there's power in that sense of urgency as you phrased it. So we have a remaining 5 minutes or so. If you want to say any words, spark any encouraging words or words of wisdom to fellow writers out there, and maybe say hello to people that you'd like to give a shout out to.
Well, I just want to thank you for doing this show. I think it's so important to put poetry out into the world wherever and however we can through
Absolutely.
many media. So thank you so much for doing this and for inviting me. I want to especially thank my friend Patrick Connors for connecting me with you and with this show, and for all of the work that he has done to build literary community in Canada.
Mhm.
And I'd say to, I don't really know who's going to be watching this, but I just want to say to any of you, I'd say, this is whatever it is that you want to do in terms of creative work, whether it's poetry or some other art form or music or just anything, whether it's, or just I don't know, decorating your house in an interesting way, or just anything, or creating something in your community, engaging in some kind of social action. It's like, we just have to keep doing it. I think writers often can get discouraged, and especially if our work gets rejected or we don't get published or that sort of thing. There's often this scarcity model of like, oh, it's competitive and there's only so much room for people to get published or to share their work. And I've found that that's not true, especially if you think in terms of just, first of all, doing the work. A writer is somebody who writes. A writer is not somebody with an MFA. A writer is not someone who's had a book published or anything published. You know, what makes you a writer versus not a writer is, are you writing? And so that's, I
Right.
think, the first step. And then the second step is just in terms of getting the work out there, just keep trying, try different means, different strategies, start your own blog, your own YouTube channel, whatever your thing is. I don't know, take sidewalk chalk and like write poems on the sidewalk in your town. Just, that's the way to do it, I'd say.
Be creative, and even if it's not poetry specifically, you know, paint a nice painting, as you said, decorate your house, or, you know, do something creative that puts your energies to beautifying things and making conversations happen. I think that's really important. That's definitely why we do this. And I appreciate your time and joining us on the program today. It's been really interesting talking to you, and I thank Patrick as well for connecting us. We had him on the show not too long back ago, so it was really nice show and we enjoyed it. And we'll help promote, and I'll send you the link as soon as possible, as soon as we get it up. So this has been an excellent New York Parrot Literary Corner, and we are the best and only TV show daily offering content for creative writers and artists of any kind who want a platform. Get in touch with us at literarycorner@newyorkparrot.com. And if anybody would like to donate to help us improve our programming and our presentation, just please go with us at paypal.me/nyparrot. That'll be anything is welcome, and we would definitely appreciate it. We appreciate our viewers very, very much. We enjoy the fact that you're enjoying our programming and having conversations with us. So please, by all means, leave comments, tell us what you like, give us some commentary, invite others to join our program and get us in touch with each other. So we're building community here. We're looking for 1 million subscribers. We're doing our best. So, and we appreciate our viewers very much, and we're glad that they're with us. Just share the program, share our flyers when we put them up. And thank you again, Jeannine, for joining us. This has been the New York Parrot Literary Corner. I'm Dustin Pickering, and this is the end of the show. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much.